Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'm actually making this video before the weekly close, so we don't actually know what it's going to close at this week, but I thought it would be timely to go ahead and make a video because Bitcoin's currently below both its 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA. Now, it is still theoretically possible for Bitcoin to get back above its 21-week EMA before the weekly close. It would need to get back up to around $62,100, so about $1,400 higher than the price at the time of this video. It's not impossible, and in fact, I mean, if you were to look at daily closes, going back essentially since February, Bitcoin has found some support around 60K for at least some time, right? You can see it's bounced off of 60K a number of times. The last couple of times, right, that it came back down to it, it bounced and then eventually went below. Here it bounced and then eventually went below. Notice though that when it bounced in May, it actually bounced all the way up to 65K, 65 and a half. When it bounced in July, it only bounced up to around 63.8. So those bounces have been getting a little bit less impressive off of 60K, at least on the initial sort of move down to that level. But I think the problem, or at least one of the things that's somewhat concerning right now, is that we've talked a lot about the 2019 move and the 2013 move, right? And one of the reasons we made the comparison to the 2019 move so frequently is because in 2019, the Fed cut rates, okay? Now, guys, there's been a lot of critics of me making this comparison to 2019. I don't know why. I mean, we've it's been very similar, right? We've had lower highs and lower lows, more or less how we had back in 2019, right? I mean, we had a high, and then we had a lower high, and a lower high, and a lower high. We had a low, and a lower low, and a lower low, and then one more lower low. And then we finally put in a double bottom. But you see, and then of course we did eventually get a recession. But that was the process that had to play out, right? That was the process that had to play out. And so I remember talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and people were like, well, there's no way Bitcoin's going to get rejected at 70K again because we got two presidential candidates talking about it at the Bitcoin conference. But I think the key thing that a lot of people are missing is that the Bitcoin market is a lot bigger than a lot of people think it is. And I think it's much more dependent on altcoin liquidity than people think it is. Because at least so far, Bitcoin has been also following that 2019 blueprint where it's been putting in lower highs and lower lows. Okay. And it's a difficult topic because obviously, a lot of people want to see the price of Bitcoin go up. They want to see it succeed, and it fundamentally makes sense. But what I think the main concern is nothing Bitcoin related, right? It's has the Fed induced a recession, right? That's the question. Or are we heading that way? And if you watch the last video I did on the Somro recession indicator, there are some growing concerns. It's not a sure thing, right? It's not a sure thing, but it is something that Bitcoin will have to contend with. That is something that Bitcoin will have to contend with. And again, there's going to be a lot of critics to that sort of view. But remember, we've been talking about this move all year long, right? We were talking about this back in March when gold broke out. Do you guys remember when gold broke out? And I was like, look, guys, when this happened in 2019, that marked the mid-cycle top, you know? And again, I'm not saying it has to play out exactly the same way, but it is interesting that up until this point, it has played out in basically the same way, right? Where you have a range for gold, right? You have this range that it's trying to break out of. And then it finally breaks out and then it marks the mid-cycle top for Bitcoin. You basically had the same thing that happened back in March, and I pointed it out back in March. And again, it wasn't a popular thing to point out, especially when you had the halving coming up, and I don't really think it was on many people's radars that April could be a lower high. But we were talking about that because, well, gold had started to break out. furthermore, the other thing that we were looking at back then was USDT dominance, right? If you look at USDT dominance, it tagged that trend line that we had been watching for a long time. We had been watching that trend line on USDT dominance for months going into it. And I said earlier this year that we likely would see it drop to around 4%. And if it's going to follow suit, then you could get that same 2019 style move where it just kind of goes up for a while. Like it goes up, puts in a low, and then a higher high, and then a higher low, right? And it just keeps working its way up. And you see how that played out? And it took a long time. Do you guys remember when I said many, many times in 2019, it's easy to look at it now and be like, oh, it was obvious, right? It was obvious that we were in a downtrend. But I said this many times, it wasn't obvious to everyone back then because everyone was so convinced that we were going to immediately go higher, right? And the reason was because we weren't really that far off the highs when you think about it, right? We weren't. I mean, even by October, Bitcoin was still wicking up above 10,000, which was not even that far off from where we had spent most of our time. So that was the issue, right? When you look at it on a chart, it looks obvious. When you live through it, is it that obvious, right? Is it obvious to the general public when you have two presidential candidates speaking at a Bitcoin conference and the Bitcoin halving and all that? Is it obvious to everyone that it's just putting in lower highs? Probably not, right? Because it doesn't feel like it should be. But that's what's happening. That doesn't mean it has to go play out like that forever. We're just making the comparison. We're saying, look, guys, in 2019, this is what it did. And the downtrend lasted 6 to 9 months. It lasted 6 months without the recession. You could have argued that would have been the soft landing. And then we got a recession, right? So if it's going to play out like 2019, again, forget about 2020. I'm not talking about 2020. I'm talking about 2019. If it follows 2019, then you get one more lower low. But in the short term, it doesn't have to happen immediately. In fact, if it were to take place over sort of these 60-day time frames, which is what it's been doing, right? If you look at these 60-day time frames, let me take a date range here, right? Sort of from like right here to here. It's about 60 days, and there is about 60 days. So if you go out again 60 days, it puts you, sometime in September, right? We also know that, as I said earlier, a lot of times when you get down to that 60K level, Bitcoin at least shows a little bit of resilience, right? So maybe at the very least it can bounce off of the level a little bit, but this is kind of how it's been playing out. So if Bitcoin goes back down to the lower part of the range, around 50K, then the 2019 fractal is complete. Okay, then we figure out how much damage the Fed has done, and if they've induced a recession or not. If they haven't, then that could be the low. If they have, then we could see lower lows from there. There theoretically is still a chance that the 2013 comparison is valid. I think the main risk with the 2013 comparison is that in 2013, after Bitcoin had that low on July 5th, right after this low on July 5th, and it got back above the 21-week EMA, it didn't really get any daily closes below it, right, in any durable fashion. You can see that we held the 21-week EMA. There were some wicks below it, but we held it. But if you go look at it today, we're starting to get some daily closes below the 21-week EMA, right? So if we take this all the way out, let me just sort of go over to where we currently are on the chart. Right, we just had a daily close below 21 EMA, and then we had another daily close below it. So that's going to be, I think, your big area of resistance, and you can see that we already wicked up to the 21-week EMA once, and we got rejected. So I would watch that level. If we can get back above it quickly, then it might imply that the 2013 comparison is still on. But if you look at what happened over here in this, so after Bitcoin put in a lower low and it was obvious that it was a lower low, it then bounced and then it spent a week or two up over here trying to stay above the 21-week EMA, but then eventually it gave up, and then it went down, it then back tested it, and then it just slowly went down. Okay, so when you look at it today, right, like, well, kind of had this move, tried to stay above the 21-week EMA, it's struggling to do so. At some point, you might see it back test that 21-week EMA. Hell, it already did it on an intraday wick. is it going to hold, right? Is it going to hold? And unfortunately, right now, it doesn't look like it's doing that. But that's why I've said before, right? It makes sense to have a plan either way, right? Like if it drops, that's why you have some cash in hand to take advantage of a potential 2019 scenario and have more cash if we get a recession. And again, there's always going to be people that are going to criticize these views, and they're going to just point to the fundamental stuff, right? They're going to say presidential candidates and all that stuff. The same stuff with the ETH Bitcoin valuation that people told me so many years ago, right? Deflationary, the merge, the tokenomics. You're underestimating it. And here we are today, right? And it really never stopped bleeding. So the market, I think, is a lot bigger than people think it is. I think Bitcoin's more dependent on altcoin liquidity than people think it is. And unfortunately, altcoins haven't really been looking so great recently, right? You could argue that alt Bitcoin pairs are maybe potentially about to drop down again. And I said before, I think the next time it's going to form a low, potential short-term low, could be about mid-August, and we're already in early August. I mean, I said this, a couple of months ago, because again, in line with those sort of that 60-day thing, right? From here to here was about 60 days. There to there, I mean, it puts you about mid to late August for it to maybe put in another low. And, I mean, if you connect the dots, you could see alt Bitcoin pairs in the low 0.3s before the month is over. And that, of course, would not be a good sign, especially for the altcoin market. Now, if Bitcoin were to bounce and follow the 2013 pattern, dominance is likely going to go up either way. So that's why I think, if you're going to have crypto exposure, I think Bitcoin makes the most amount of sense. I also think, having some dry powder can make some sense, especially if this does follow the 2019 pattern and you see it come back down to this low here by September. So I think it makes sense to be prepared for those scenarios, because, there's always going to be different views, right? There's always going to be different views. And I said this, I said this back several months ago when everyone was calling for alt season. They were looking at total 3 and they're like, oh, well, this, a lot of them are saying look like 2020, because they're like, oh, this is just 2020, about the same time in the cycle, right? Why is it not the same thing? You know why, right? You know why. I don't have to tell you if you've been watching this channel at all. You know why it wasn't the same thing. Is because they underestimated alt Bitcoin pairs capitulation potential. In 2020, when alts were trending above the 20-week SMA, they had already capitulated to the lows. And again, alts are oscillators against Bitcoin at best, is my view. They had already come down to the lows, right? So over here, it made sense that they were going up because they had already checked in with the lows. Here in 2024, guess what? They never checked in with the lows. That's why people thought we were here in the cycle. They thought we were here because it was a halving year. And like, well, the market goes up in the halving year. But in reality, what if we were in the 2019 move? What if we were there? And the move that they want maybe doesn't happen until next year, after alt Bitcoin pairs go to the range lows, right? So when you look at the market like that, when you remember there's a secret, there's a key to unlocking the secrets of the Cryptoverse, and it's Bitcoin dominance. When you remember that, right, and you look at Bitcoin dominance, and you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, you would have known there's a high likelihood that people were just blowing hopium by saying that this was like, 2020, when alt Bitcoin pairs hadn't gone down to the range lows yet. But if you followed Bitcoin dominance, you would have known there is still a good chance alts would sell off. And this is another great example where that happens, right? Where now you look back and you're like, well, okay, DOT is back at $5. ADA is back at 36 cents. Avalanche is back at $22, right? And you can see how they slowly work their way down, right? They capitulate, they consolidate, they backtest the prior support and the bull market support, and they get rejected, go to a new low, right? Do it again. You rinse and repeat until the Fed cuts enough and lowers rates enough, and goes back to QE sufficiently to cause the bleeding to stop. Again, I mean, even XRP, people were screaming about this one like crazy a couple of weeks ago. But is it really that different, right? Matic, I mean, it's now at 45 cents, right? Link getting rejected again, right? Doge getting rejected again. You can see how it's playing out. You can see the similarities with 2019. And you can see that despite all of it, despite the fact that Total 3 has not been able to get back above its bull market support band in any sustained capacity since June, and Total 2 hasn't really either, Bitcoin's holding up the best, right? I mean, it's at least near the 21-week EMA. This is why I've said for 3 years now, Bitcoin should do better than the collective altcoin market, right? I'm not saying Bitcoin can't go down. Guys, this is a market, right? I mean, the hardest thing for people to do is to recognize that trends can sometimes change. You know, I fall for that too, right? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But that's the problem, right? You have these lower highs, you have these lower lows. It'll probably change at some point. I'm not here to tell you it's going to last forever. It's just, imagine if you were buying a lot of altcoins through here instead of Bitcoin. If you bought Bitcoin, you're probably still doing somewhat okay. You're maybe a little underwater. And, I wasn't buying Bitcoin up here because, well, the risk levels were too high. In ITC Premium, as I said, I was buying it over here between 15K and 21K. This was published on ITC Premium. And up here, the risk level has been too high for my risk tolerance. For some people's risk tolerance, maybe not so high. But for mine, it was too high. In fact, it would actually call for selling some up here because we were in the 0.7 to 0.8 risk band. But again, good luck convincing other people of that. So Bitcoin has done remarkably well over the last couple of years. If you're worried, if you're freaking out that it's at 60K, just remember earlier this year, it was at 41K. Okay? Not that long ago. Literally about half a year ago, a little more than half a year ago, Bitcoin was at 41K, basically 40K, $20,000 lower than where it is right now. So, I can't help but think that a lot of what we have talked about since March has been playing out. It just feels like it hasn't because it's taking a long time. And every time we get north of 70K and the bulls come out and say it's going to 100, you feel the emotion, right? And they mock any other view. But guess what? Bitcoin's been holding up bad. These are the things we said. Bitcoin will hold up the best. Alts will struggle until looser monetary policy arrives. And that's been happening, right? Bitcoin's at 60K, right? That might sound bad to you, but, the reality is Bitcoin was also at 60K in July and in May and in April and in March and in February. It's basically been at 60K at some point in basically almost every single month going back to March and February. What about alts? Well, you go check in with Polkadot. You're like, okay, well, in March it was $12. And in May it was $7 to $8. It was $8, $7 to $8. And now it's $5. You're like, with ADA, okay, well, in March it was 80 cents. And then in April it was 40 to 50 cents. And now it's 36 cents. And with Avalanche, okay, well, back over here, it was $64. And then it was $34. So now it's $22. Do you see the point? Again, you could argue I'm just cherry picking, altcoins that people don't care about. But these were the alts that people were so interested in last cycle. And if your response is just to say, well, you should talk about the newer alts, what you're seeing happen to these alts will happen to those alts too, eventually, more than likely, for most of them. Just because they're a cycle behind doesn't mean this is not the inevitable outcome for them too. So you have to be careful of the altcoin market. I'm not saying you can't make money in it. I'm just saying that when interest rates are going up and staying high and quantitative tightening is continuing, just ride the Bitcoin dominance rally and live your life. That's the point, right? That's the point. Just ride the Bitcoin dominance rally, let the altcoins bleed back to the kink until looser monetary policy arrives. And then once it arrives and everyone gives up and everyone becomes a Bitcoin maxi, that's when alt season finally starts. We're not there yet, in my opinion. But I think it could happen next year. Maybe once everyone gives up. But it's been a long journey. I don't I don't know what's gonna happen with Bitcoin in the next month or so. I mean, like, it's still possible it could follow the 2013 move, right? I mean, I think the biggest thing that's working against it is the fact that it's now back below the 21-week EMA. Um, and that didn't really happen back then, at least not even on daily closes. We'll see where the weekly close comes in. There's still maybe chance to salvage it. So I don't want to say that that's not a possibility. It could still be. I think the problem is that you are getting some, some signals in other parts of the market that are not so great, right? I mean, the unemployment rate is starting to really move up here, and if you were to if you were to just look at the unemployment rate and just compare, right? Just compare the last several cycles, right? The last several cycles. I'm not even sure. It's not really looking how it. I mean, you can kind of see. I'm not really overlaying them that great right here, but you can kind of. I did it yesterday in the video, but I mean, you can kind of see how it's. It's following what it normally does, right? I mean, it consolidates for a while, and then eventually it moves up in a nonlinear fashion. I think we've entered that nonlinear phase. And that's sort of the scary part is we don't know how bad it's going to get until it's over, right? There's no way to know. And that's why I think you're seeing Bitcoin sell off. Because the market's worried, right? So we'll see what happens here at 60K. If history is any indication, you might see it try to get a bounce. But if history is any indication, that 21-week EMA could provide some resistance. I want to remind you that in a week or so, you will get a death cross. So if the market doesn't bounce between now and then, oftentimes it will bounce once the death cross occurs. Normally, a death cross elicits a lot of negative emotion, but historically, when a death cross arrives, Bitcoin gets a bounce into it. Okay, and I mean, if you were to sort of extrapolate these, you're going to see it happen within the next week or so. Okay, within about a week, you'll see the death cross occur. So just remember that. And I mean, you could actually, we said it last year too, right? We said when the death cross occurs, you'll likely see Bitcoin get a move up, and then, death cross, and then Bitcoin moved up, right? In 2019, same thing, right? Even though 2019 still continued down, by the way. But if you go back and look at 2019, guess what? After the death cross occurred, Bitcoin bounced, and then it came back down, right? So again, just throwing it out there. You're likely going to see these events actually happen within the next week or so. If it's going to follow 2013, it needs to repair the damage that it's done relatively quickly and not go below 60K. If it goes below 60K within the next couple of weeks, I think, and gets daily closes down there, I think there's a high likelihood that you're going to go back down to the lower part of this trend line, which would put you closer on 50K, and it would happen by September theoretically. So that's where we are right now. We'll see how it plays out. Again, if you're not sure what's going to happen, like me, crypto exposure could still just be limited to Bitcoin rather than altcoins, because altcoins are really stuck in traffic on struggle street. Even though Bitcoin's still at 60K, a lot of alts are 50 to 60 to 70% down over the last few months. And also, if there does end up being some larger drops ahead, figure out a way to take advantage of something like that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.